Hi everyone, it is Krista from Krista's Quilting Services, and I am here with our week 2 videos in the design along. Week 2 has a 4-part instructional series. The first 2 parts are breaking down the math and assembly for the individual blocks that you might have designed. And the 3rd and 4th parts in that series go over figuring out the fabric requirements that you will need for the quilt that you designed. I also have a couple of bonus videos included. One is an intro video to the whole week 2 set, and the other goes over a few terms and shows what those actually look like with fabric. Let's take a look at the larger quilt that I have, the larger blocks that I made for this quilt. As I went through it, there were only 2 unique blocks, 3 different colorways, but it is either this rectangular set to travel along each side of my interconnected blocks, and the corner blocks for turning that. Before I start figuring out what I need for each block, I need to decide how large I'm going to make it. I have 8 blocks going across and 8 blocks going down, and having a full block here at the size of 9 inches is a really comfortable number to work with when doing all the math for each block unit. So a 9-inch block times 8 of them is 72. So this will get me a quilt top that is 72 inches by 72 inches. And that's a decent size. Let's figure out what sizes of fabric I'm going to need for each one of these pieces. So I've decided that this is going to finish as a 9-inch block, and we begin our math with that finished size. So a third of 9 inches is going to be 3 inches going across, and it's the full 9-inch length. So 3 by 9 for the light, and my next dark one is 3 inches by 9 inches. Then we add our 1/2 inch rule to find our cutting measurements for these blocks. So I'm going to have a 3.5 inch by 9.5 inch strip for each of these. So I already showed the math here. I'm just going to go ahead and write the numbers for the other 2 blocks, or for the other 2 cuts. The next thing to figure out is the assembly method. When you have strips like this, there are a couple of choices. You can cut out each individual 3.5 by 9.5 inch piece, or you can do another method called strip piecing. Strip piecing is great when you need that same block in the exact same way multiple times. And in the case of my quilt here, I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 14. I need 14 of these in blue, and I'll need 14 of them in pink. The strip piecing method works a little bit like this. So we've kind of touched on the idea of width of fabric. So width of fabric is when it comes off the bolt and you've got these really like heavy ends on each side of they're fabric, but they're different, your selvage edges. So width of fabric is the distance in between. So here's a selvage edge and here's a selvage edge, and width is that distance going in between here. When it's wrapped on the bolt, you can cut off like a 30-inch piece, a 50-inch piece, a 100-inch piece. that amount that you have control over how much, that is your length of fabric. So when strip piecing, you are going to cut a strip, and in this case, we know that these pieces are 3.5 inch strips. So I would cut a 3.5 inch strip from my fabric that goes all the way across that width, and I'm going to cut it in a dark, and then I'm going to do the same thing for a light, and then I'm going to have one more dark. And those seams, you're going to sew them together, so you have 3 very long pieces of fabric sewn together. And it would be a little bit like if we imagine that these were all blue and that there wasn't a cut in here, it's just going to keep going across. Once you have that, you have this part this way, but you haven't cut it yet into this 9.5 inch width. So what you do, once it's sewn this way, you cut, then you make these 9.5 inch sub cuts. So I take it, cut it, measure off 9.5 inches, cut it, move the fabric along, cut my next 9.5 inches, move the fabric along, cut another 9.5 inches. And from one with the fabric, I know that I'm going to get 4 of my blue blocks like this. I'm going to get 4 cuts this way. To know that, the math is, I know I need 9.5 inches, and it's just figuring out how many of these 9.5 inch cuts will fit in, how many fit in a approximately 40 inch strip. So I can get 4, 4 times 9.5 is 38. And even if there were, if your strip set ended up being like 42 inches in that width of fabric, because we've talked about how we just round down to 40 inches, each fabric manufacturer and line can be a little bit different, some being a little bigger, some being a little bit smaller. So 38 inches, that's all I'm going to get. There's, even if it were like a full 42 to 44 inches of usable fabric, that's only at most an extra 6 inches. So you're not going to get a 5th block. This method is really quick when you need to produce this many pieces. It is also a lot less cutting to worry about too. It's easier to cut a width of fabric strip, sew it together, and then subcut. And it makes for a much cleaner and better lined up block as well. Let's talk about finding the fabric totals for this rectangular block. So knowing that I've already decided to do that whole strip piecing method, I'm going to use how many blocks I can get out of one strip to help me determine the number of strips I need to make, or a strip set. So the strip is just one piece. The strip set is all 3 of these pieces that have been sewn together here. My total number of blocks in the blues, I need 7 for each color, so 14 altogether. I can get 4 blocks cut out of one strip set. So I can get close to 14 if I have 3 sets, or 3 strip sets. That's going to give me 12 blocks, which isn't enough. So I need to make 1 more set to get my last 2 blocks. So there is going to be some leftovers in the strip set, but again, leftovers are never a bad thing. If one of these strip set pieces you cut the wrong size, you haven't lost anything. You've got enough left to make a correct cut and and then get rid of the one that didn't cut at the right size. So 3 sets gives me 12 blocks plus 1 more set. I need a total of 4 strip sets. So now, taking that information, each strip set needs a light and a dark. So 2 dark sets at 3.5 inches each. Is 7 inches of dark blue per strip set. Times that by 4 sets. So 7 times 4 gives me 28 inches of the blue. It's always a good idea to round up a little bit. I would add just 1 extra 3.5 inch set to start with. So that gives me 31.5 inches. And you don't want to be super specific when you're buying fabric. It's just round up all the time. Never down, because down means that you can be short fabric. So always up. And in this case, I would just go up to 35 inches for that purchase. And that's going to end up actually giving you this twice over. So if you end up not needing the extra bit of blue, you have either a little bit built up now to create your own fabric stash, or you can also maybe use that as part of binding your quilt when we get to that stage. So 35 inches of blue, of the dark blue, for this section over here. So I am going to grab my fabric totals sheet and I'm going to write 35 inches over here. All right, let's figure out how much we need for the light blue fabric. So with that strip piecing information that we had before, we know that we need to make 4 sets. And we only need 1 of these light blue strips within each set. So the math for this one is actually fairly simple. We know that we need 4 sets at 1 strip. Okay, and I'm just going to bring this down. So 4 times, and that strip is 3.5 inches. And this is going to tell me how many inches of fabric I need to buy to cut out these strips. So 4 times 3 is 12, and half of 4 is 2, so 14 inches total for that set. But always add in extra fabric. So let's add 3.5 inches. So 14 plus 3.5 inches is 17.5. And always round up. So that 17.5 is just going to go up to a tens number. So we're going to choose 20 inches for purchasing. And as always, if you end up with a little bit left over, that is just fine. So my light blue fabric subtotal initially here is a 20-inch amount for this rectangle block. The next block that we need to count for is the corner block. There are 4 corners for each of my blues, so altogether I have a total of 8 corners, and the same thing for the pinks. So let's figure out the sizes of each subcut here, of each section within the total block. So my first one is 1/3 across, and because it's a 9-inch block, 9 divided by 3 is going to be 3, and it's going the full length of my block is 9. And just that reminder one more time, when we start our math, it's always based off the finished size, and finished means when it's all sewn into the quilt. This block, if you take a ruler to it, will measure across 9 by 9. Once you have your finished size, then we get to do the add the 1/2 inch rule for the seam allowance. So adding a 1/2 inch gives me a 3.5 inch cut by 9.5 inch cut. And that's just for my dark blue. And we're going to just do the dark blue bits first here, or we'll find the totals for all pieces here. And we're focusing first on the fabric totals for the blue blocks. So this one now runs 2/3 of my block across, and 2/3 of 9 is going to be 6. So 6 inches this way, and it runs 1/3 of my block, so that is 3 inches. And adding the 1/2 inch rule, so 6.5 inches to cut it by 3.5 inches. My light blue block is exactly the same size. So it's also 6 by 3 finished. And my cutting requirements are 6.5 by 3.5. And then we're on to our smaller blocks here. And these are 1/3 in both directions. So it is a 3 by 3 finished square. When I add my 1/2 inch cutting allowance, I will cut each of these at 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches for both the light blue and the dark blue. Let's go on to the corner block. And now that we've got our cutting and fabric measurements already figured out here, we can go ahead and decide on assembly. This block can also be assembled partially with strip piecing. So anytime that you have 2 pieces of fabric together that are consistently the same across multiple blocks, you can strip piece them and then subcut them. So just to go over that strip piecing concept again, you have that width of fabric, which means your selvage edge here and here, and we know that there's approximately 40 inches of usable fabric. And strip piecing involves sewing 2 different pieces together. So I'm going to put a stitch line going across here. I'm going to draw another selvage edge bit, and I'm going to label D for dark, L for light blue. So this is my dark blue piece and my light blue piece. And with that strip piecing, we're cutting the narrowest part of that block. So it's going to be a 3.5 inch strip sewn to another 3.5 inch strip. So that is labeled here. And once it's all sewn together, then we subcut that strip into these 6.5 inch widths. So just to kind of demonstrate, so assume that we measure it 6.5 inches, cut. 6.5 inches, you make your next cut all the way across until you cannot cut any more of them. And then we're going to do the same thing for these two as well, because consistently I have a dark blue and a light blue sewn together. So that dark blue piece sewn to a light blue piece, and because it's a 3.5 inch strip as well, I'm going to mark that. And then because my other direct dimension is 3.5 inches, I'm going to then later cut these out, measure 3.5 inches, make a cut. 3.5 inches, make a cut. And I'm going to be left with these two pieces already sewn together. So now for the math part of figuring out how much fabric we need, or how many strips are going to be involved. So that's kind of the first thing. It's not how much fabric initially, but rather how many strips. So I need a total of 8 corner blocks. So 4 for this one and 4 more for this one. So I'm just going to write 8 blocks up here. And this is going to be where I figure out the number of strips necessary. So 8 blocks. And if I'm cutting these by 3.5 inches, so 3.5 times 8 is 24 plus 4 more, so 28. I need 28 inches of that strip set. And remember that a whole strip set has 40 inches of usable space. I have an extra 12 inches available to me here from this one. Okay, and having extra, that's always a good thing. So this one, I'm cutting these into 6.5 inch parts. So how many times can I get 6.5 in out of a 40 inch piece? So let's start by going, finding out the total of inches that I need here. So 6.5 times, I know that I'm going to need 8 blocks. So 48, 52. I'm going to need 52 inches of fabric, which means ultimately 2 strip sets. However, remembering that these strip sets, there's 40 inches on them. If I subtract 40 from 52, I am also left with 12 inches. And that 12 inches can be borrowed out of my 3.5 inch block cut to complete it. So I do not necessarily need to make a third strip set of these dark and lights. It's a good idea to have the fabric available for a third strip set just in case. But if all your cuts go well, you should be just fine. So let's grab the corner block in my dark page here, and we can figure out how much we need of the dark fabric. So I need 1 strip set for my 3.5 inch blocks, and I need 1 strip for my 6.5 inches, knowing that my last ones are going to use the rest of this. So I'm only making 2 strip sets, so 3.5 inches times 2 strips is 7 inches. However, in case we have a bad cut somewhere, whether it's cutting the strip set or cutting the strips themselves, I would recommend adding an extra 3.5 inches, and that gives you 10.5 here. So from there, round up always still. So even though you could round down to 10, you know that 10 isn't really extra, because then you're not going to get your extra 1/2 inch that you need for a strip in case of error. So round that up to a 15-inch piece of fabric needed for here. And if something really goes wrong with your cutting, you can still have another 3.5 inch set out of this. You actually have extra to do this twice. So 15 inches more on the dark fabric. So I'm going to bring that over here and add 15 inches to my number on my fabric total. So 35 inches of dark fabric for my for these blocks, and 15, oh, actually, hold on, I am missing something here. It's 15 inches needed for these. I missed this piece over here. This happens all the time. When you're figuring out math for your quilt, go over it on more than one occasion and on more than one day. Okay, so now we need to figure out that 9.5 inch block. You can get 4 cuts for 9.5 out of a 3.5 inch strip. And you need a total of 8 of these blocks. So 8 strips divided by 4 cuts per width of fabric, WOF, width of fabric. And that's the fabric that is in between on your strip piecing, those selvage edges. So this is width of fabric. So you need 2 strips of dark blue to get this. And those 2 strips are going to be 3.5 inches each. So that's 7 inches altogether. So because we already have a whole extra in here, let's just add that 15 and the 7 together. So that's 22. And in this case, because we've definitely added this in twice to get that 15, you could just round down 10.5 plus 3.5 is 13.5, 2.5. Yeah, so there's 2.5 inches extra in this here than what you need here, and 2.5 is greater than your 2 over here. So you could round this one down to 20. If you still really wanted to be on the safe side, you could add it up to 25, but I'm just going to keep this at 20 inches. So I'm going to update my fabric total number here at 20 inches. So all together in my dark blue fabric, I'm going to need 55 inches. With my dark blue fabric figured out, my pinks have the exact same fabric needs. The squares are the same size. I have the same number of corner squares and the same number of these other directional running squares. So my pink, I'm just going to do that, and I know that I need 55 inches over here. Okay, so let's go back over to the light blues. We figured out fabric totals for the for that rectangular block, but we haven't finished figuring out fabric totals for the corner block. figuring out what I need for the light fabrics in my corner block is going to be really quick because I had these pieces and these pieces are the same. So I'm just going to look back here to this first part where I had figured out from my strip sets and how much extra I needed. And this one here, this 7 inches was needed for this piece. So for my corner, for the lights, I need and we'll just kind of reinforce the end from here. So I have a total of 2 strip sets that are needed because my larger ones are going to borrow from the extra of these ones. And each strip set, or each strip for that set is going to cut at 3.5 inches. So 3.5 inch strips times 2. I labeled the one on the darkest strips, but we'll call it strip sets over here because it's 2 strip sets. So times 2 strip sets is 7 inches of fabric, and always add the extra bit of fabric, so 3.5 inches in case we goof up. Gives you 10.5 inches, and always round up because you can't go down or you'll cut yourself short on fabric. So 15 inches on that light blue. So I'm going to come back over here, add 15 inches for my light blue, and I'm going to just double check that concept of how much light blue is here compared to dark blue and why it isn't exactly half. And that had to do with the fact of the number of strip sets that I needed to make. I have to make 1 extra strip set in order to have enough of these blocks. So a total of 35 inches is needed for the light blue, and the same total of 35 inches is going to be needed for the pink. Now we need to figure out fabric requirements for the green, the dark and light green kind of rectangular set here. It's the same measurements otherwise as my blue set. So I'm going to reference back to my strip piecing diagram for the green as well. So I'm just gonna kind of pop in the extra selvage edges here. Okay, so I know that I need a dark green, a light green, and a dark green. Each of my strips are cut at 3.5 inches all the way through. And the thing that we have to remember is I can only get 4 sets of these out of 1 strip. So now I need to count how many of these I need. And I need 1, 2, 3, 4, exactly. So I only need to make 1 strip set for the greens. So in my rectangular block, 1 strip set is needed, and I have 1 strip set times 2 dark pieces. Okay, so 1 strip set. These dark pieces are 3.5 inches each. So I'm going to add them together for a total 3.5 and 3.5. That's 7 inches. So I just need 7 inches of the dark green, and I only need 1 3.5 inch. So 1 strip of times 1 light green So that light green strip is 3.5 inches for that. Okay, so again, our round up rule, always make sure that you're adding in an extra whatever that strip is. So 7 plus 3.5 inches gets you 10.5. So you have to round up to 15 inches. So you're not going to be short on green here for this. And for your small one here, 3.5 inches, if you goof on the light green, you need to have at least one more strip there. So add that extra 3.5 inch strip, and 7 inches is just fine for here, but round up again, always. So 10 inches of light green in your rectangle block and 15 inches of dark green in your rectangle block. So let's bring up the fabric total, and we'll put 15 of the dark and 10 of the light. Now we need to find the fabric requirements for the corner block here. So let's start off with, again, that strip piecing method first. So pairing a light and a dark here and a light and a dark. So these dimensions are the same as before. So referencing the strip piecing diagram, I know that I'm going to need a dark and a light for my 6.5 inch pieces and a dark and a light for my 3.5 inch pieces. And what we're going to have to figure out is just, or I'm just going to erase these and change these numbers to 4 because there's only a total of 4 corner pieces. What we're looking to find out is if they can still fit on one strip set. We needed 2 strip sets for these, and it worked because we were able to borrow the leftover fabric from the 2 small squares to finish what was needed for the large squares. So let's start with our 3.5 inch cuts. We need 4 of those. Oh, don't want to use pen for this. And that's going to get me 12, so 14 inches is how much I need from the strip set to get these pieces. And 6.5 times 4, so 6 times 4, 24, plus 2, that's 26 inches. And 26 plus 14 is exactly 40 inches. You can definitely get away with 1 strip set of a dark green and a light green. But just in case something happens, make sure you have enough fabric to make an additional strip set. So whether you accidentally cut one of these strips too big or too small, or when you're cutting, doing your subcuts, maybe you lose track and you cut 5 of your 3.5 inches instead of 4 of them. That's going to prevent you from getting what you need here, and you will have to create another strip set to finish this last cut. So for the green blocks, let's start with the dark green. So you only need 1 set plus extra. So you want 7 inches of the dark green, and same thing, the light is going to have the same number. You only need 1 3.5 inch strip, but plus an extra is going to give you 7 inches. And this time I'm going to remember my bigger block here. There's only 4 of these needed, which means just 1 strip of green, because you can make 4 9.5 inch cuts out of 1 width of fabric. So the 3.5 by 9.5 block or piece, one strip at 3.5 inches to cut that. And just to be on the safe side again, in case you make a mistake here, plus extra. So I would get 7 inches of dark just to make sure you're safe here, and 7 inches of dark to make sure that you are safe on these pieces, and 7 inches of light to make sure you're safe here. So the dark total on this page is 14 inches total, and light total is just 7 inches. So I'm going to write that on my fabric totals page. So dark is an extra 14 inches, green is 7 inches, and adding up, so 14 and 15 is 29, so round it up to 30. And 10 plus 7, that's 17, just round it up to 20 inches. I know it seems quite generous just to continue rounding up all the time. However, it's better to be safe and have the extra than it is to have to go back to the store and purchase some more fabric. And that's if it's even still there.